Okay, so we kind of left off here with this Chinese piece from the Han Dynasty, and it was carved using nephrite, which is an expensive form of jade. And we were talking about those little, basically raised circles on the discs. They're called bosses, and they line up in these perfectly even rows. So that's really detailed, hard to come up with, but they took their time, obviously, with this, and I'm sure it was a very expensive, labor-intensive process. And we can see there's a feline type monster, or it could be considered possibly a dragon. And then we have these other kind of abstracted shapes that kind of suggest either blowing clouds or wind. And it kind of creates a pattern. So that's kind of an interesting piece, a lot of pattern in it, in that piece. So we're going to move on to wood carving. So typically walnut and cypress wood are preferred because they have both strength and ease of working. So they're not too hard to work with, or not too hard of a surface to carve into. So a variety of tools can be used to carve wood. Gouges, chisels are just a couple of those tools that might be used. Sandpaper, probably for the final finishing process, if they're looking for a smooth surface anyway. And artists subtract the material until the final form is reached. So we'll talk about Elizabeth Catless' Mother and Child piece here from 1971. It's made out of walnut. It's quite large, 38 inches. And so the gesture of the mother kind of suggests anguish. She has a very kind of, her head is uplifted. She has her chin up here. She has this elbow poking out. So there's some diagonal lines here that lead your eye. There's another diagonal here as well. Both figures are pretty highly abstracted, and this anguish the mother is feeling with this piece could be that the mother is struggling herself, because, you know, raising a child is a very time-consuming, hard process, or it might be that she's struggling over thinking of the struggles that her child will have as her child grows. So there could be a couple different interpretations on what this piece actually means. There's kind of a bold sweeping curves present in this piece. You know, it's very curvilinear in form, with a few more angular shapes, mostly coming from the two arms that are kind of serving to frame in these two centralized heads of the child and the mother. And there is actually an engraved line here that indicates the mother's hand. And the wood is actually really smooth and highly polished, and probably, you know, beeswax might have been added to give it a little bit of a sheen. And it really makes you kind of want to touch it. So the next method that we're going to go over is constructing and assembling. So throughout history, the major sculpting technique that was used in the Western world was modeling, carving, and casting, which is what we've just gone over with the last few videos. But in the 20th century, assembling methods have become popular. So we're going to talk about assembled sculpture next. It's a different type of sculpture, a different method, or, you know, material to create sculpture. And this is when artists actually put together pieces that they have shaped themselves. So when they shape those pieces themselves and put those together, that is called a construction. But when sculpture is built from found objects, that is called assemblage. So definitely, you know, construction and assemblage, there's a little bit of a difference there. Construction is more of a custom process, whereas assemblage uses found objects. But they both definitely fall under constructing and assembling techniques. So in the 1920s, Spaniard Julio Gonzalez pioneered the use of the welding torch for cutting and welding metal sculpture. So welding had been invented in 1895, but it took 3 decades for artists to use this new tool for sculpture, and Gonzalez had learned welding while working briefly in an automobile factory. He actually started off as a painter, but was not very successful, and then he actually began assisting Picasso with the construction of metal sculptures. And then he actually, after that, began creating his own constructions. So we'll actually take a look at one of his pieces that he made called Maternity from 1934. And it has kind of this feminine anatomy on top of a stone base. So it's a little bit of a mixture of materials. We have the steel and the stone together. It's, fairly large, 49 and 7/8 inches, and done in 1934 by Julio Gonzalez. And it's basically, he welded these flexed iron rods to create his construction. And it's quite airy and playful, and it does suggest a feminine anatomy atop of a stone base. Okay, so we're still under constructing and assembling. We're going to talk about Phyla Barlow. So she uses carpentry to create construction, and she fills galleries to the point of almost obstruction. Her recent work is entitled Stilted Crates 2015, and it kind of seems dangerous to approach, actually. It's definitely a mixture of materials, and it does resemble a spider atop of unsteady looking stilts. So as a viewer, you might actually wonder if this piece is safe to be around, but they are carefully constructed, and they are actually quite safe to move around. And it's definitely a mixture of materials, so timber, polystyrene, cement, steel, plastic, paint, lots of different elements, mixed media going into this assembled sculpture. Actually, this might be considered a construction. So Marc-Andre Robinson, thrown for the greatest rapper of all time, kind of a humorous piece from 2005. And this is actually an assemblage because he found these materials. So we can see he went to some thrift stores and found these old chairs, and he made this assemblage from found materials, found chairs, and we can see the lower centerpiece is based on found chairs, but he added this higher back and almost these, so the higher back here and then these wings that come off on the sides. And the purpose of this is to kind of be a throne, and it should dignify whoever sits in it. And this throne is basically a higher form of a chair, but mostly made from chairs. So it's kind of a very interesting piece. I really like it, actually, and I really like the name of it too. I think it's clever and funny, and a really interesting way to make a new chair from many chairs. It's kind of an interesting idea. So I think I'm going to skip that. You can read about this in the book. This is basically kind of an artist spotlight in a way on Martin Poirier. But we're going to talk about kinetic sculpture now. So Alexander Calder is basically one of the most famous artists who really first explored the possibility of kinetic sculpture. And kinetic sculpture is sculpture that moves. So that's kind of interesting to think about kinetic sculpture. They're just adding the element of movement to it to make it even that more interesting. So sculptors traditionally focus on mass, but with Calder, he focused on shape, space, and movement. And his works are often called mobiles because the suspended parts move in response to small air currents. So we'll take a look at one of his pieces. This is one of his pieces. It's very modern, primary colors, and it's hard to tell because this is an interior and it's not a video, but these pieces will actually move separately, very much like a mobile that you might find over the top of a kid's crib. And actually we have a very similar sculpture. It's not as bright. I think it's rusty metal, but it is a kinetic sculpture inside of Brockman on the Montana State University Northern Campus. So kind of interesting, definitely influenced by the work of Alexander Calder. And so we'll talk about Jesus Rafael Soto. He also creates mobiles, but they are much different and more delicate than Calder's pieces. So this piece is called Escultura Hurtado, which is Hurtado writing. basically is what that means. From 1975, so it's a kind of a mixed media piece, paint, wire, nylon cord, and wood. So curved wire slowly sways in the air against a background of painted thin vertical stripes. These wire pieces resemble the strokes of handwriting, hence the title. So you can see those wire pieces here in the front. Their motion makes the background seem to vibrate. So these pieces actually will move. So it is a kinetic sculpture as well. So we'll talk about Gene Tingley. He uses electricity and human-made power to move his large work, Meta Harmony 2. So viewers can actually activate this work with a foot pedal on the floor, and then rotors start to move, and in turn it hits gongs and drums and rubs against abrasive surfaces and even bangs on the piano to create kind of a cacophony of sound. And not only does this sculpture move, it makes sound too. So it's very interactive. You can see here, this is from 1979, and it's kind of a mixture of scrap iron, musical instruments, and other objects. So it's definitely an assemblage. You can see plastic, rubber, leather, glass, lots of different types of materials, mixed media. So definitely an interesting piece that does a lot of things. It moves, it makes sound, you interact with it. So it's kind of a cool piece, really. So we'll talk about mixed media. Let me just check and see how much time we have. Okay, we can keep going for now. So mixed media is when artists use a wide array of materials to create a single work. Sometimes there is a long list of materials, or they may be identified only as mixed media. A mixed media work includes only found objects, and the work may also be called an assemblage, which is what we've talked about. We're talking about sculpture here, remember, too, so just keep that in mind. A mixed media work may include two-dimensional or three-dimensional elements. Often the choice of media expresses some cultural or symbolic meaning. So Kai Gao Kang, Inopportune, Stage 1 from 2004. So we have 9 cars and sequenced multi-channel light tubes. And these are actually definitely contemporary. He's a Chinese-born artist. He creates these large mixed media sculptures, and this one is called Inopportune, Stage 1 from 2004, and it's actually in the Seattle Art Museum. Still have a little bit of time. So the work consists of 9 automobiles that are kind of perforated by these light tubes that come out of them. The cars are arrayed as if we are seeing a momentary glimpse in time of one car actually flipping and getting into some kind of crazy accident. And then it is basically kind of exploding too. And those tubes of light that come out at these violent angles do suggest explosion. So Kai intended this work to refer both to contemporary action movies, where cars often explode and fly through the air. So he's kind of referencing action movies and film, and also to car bombings by terrorists. So the work challenges us to consider if this is a thrilling scene as in a movie or a horrendous one as in real life. So kind of an interesting piece.